guys, Tyler from Meeple Mountain here with a brand new game from WizKids Games. It is the new two-player game of Seastead. Here in this game, set in the Flotilla universe, you and a rival will be competing to eke out the scraps that are left for mankind in an entirely flooded world. You'll be diving below the waters to gain the old artifacts of the past to help mankind make a new life on these flotillas that you've built and try to make things just better or not suck as bad. All the while, you'll be cleaning up radiation, building new buildings, and attempting to gain fame and glory as the savior of mankind. You'll be cooperating competitively with your rival. You'll be helping each other. You'll be giving them some resources as you dive, sharing the good for the good of mankind. But really, you want to make sure you are the one remembered and leave your mark on humanity as its true savior. So while you may be helping your rival a little bit, you want to make sure that ultimately you're giving yourself the edge so that your name is the one that they write down in their waterproof history books. So jump in with me, let's dive in and learn a little bit about Seastead, some of the tight strategic decisions that you have to make, and why I think you're gonna really like this game. Seastead is a competitive game for two players where you and a rival will be working to build your structures onto the 4 flotillas of the game board. You'll be working to gain the most victory points or stars throughout the game before your opponent does, and become the most well-known savior of humanity in this waterlogged future. You'll do this by collecting resources. The 4 types in the game are algae, iron, fish, and artifacts, and you'll be spending them on the corresponding flotilla to build structures there by paying 2 to 6 of that resource based on the location in which you would like to build on a given flotilla. In the game, you will take 2 simple actions. You will either dive or you will build. Diving consists of flipping the top card of the dive deck and orienting it so that it faces both yourself and your opponent, where each of you will collect the resources on that half of the card. This is one of the initial startup cards, or the shallows. This dictates that the card would be oriented towards the green player. So in this instance, the card would be split as such. The green player would receive a fish and an iron, and the orange player would receive an artifact and an algae. For the setup of the game, it also dictates that this flotilla with the artifact will be locked. That means that when we get to flipping the quest requirements for these various flotillas, this particular flotilla is safe for the time being. What I mean by that is, while this may be the algae flotilla right now, in which case you would be spending algae to build buildings on this particular flotilla, throughout the game, these may start to flip around. So the best laid plans can go to ruin quickly if you're not staying on top of where your resources are and where they may be going. The second action that you can do on your turn is the build action. To build, you will spend the resources that you have on a matching flotilla by paying the cost. For instance, if we had 2 fish and the green player wanted to build here on this lowest point of his fish location, he could spend 2 to build a structure here. He can choose any of his leftmost structures. The 3 structures that he could choose to build are shipyards, academies, and ports. There are 3 different types of buildings that a player can choose to build in Seastead. You have shipyards, academies, and ports. Each of these buildings grant specific bonuses when they're built onto a flotilla tile in the game. You'll always pick from your leftmost building that you have available, but let's talk a little bit about the advantages and the strategic options that each building offers. First up is shipyards. Shipyards grant you the ability to place ships around the various flotillas of the game. So for instance, say I built a shipyard here. That will unlock my very first ship. I'll have access to 1 ship that I can place on any of the flotillas in the game, but let's say for instance I placed it here. You can place your ships at various flotillas, but they always offer you the same kind of passive ability. It grants you a discount of 1 resource of that type whenever you want to build somewhere. So for instance, the cost of this particular flotilla would be 2 fish. But for me to build here now, it would only cost me 1 fish. Also, if your opponent wants to build in a location where you have a ship, you get a free resource when they do so. Ships offer you a really nice strategy and kind of tactical option for you. If you're trying to discount the more expensive locations, you can do that to work your way up and get the most points and bonuses that you can on a flotilla. But you can also use them to kind of place them where you think your opponent might go so that you can get some resources and keep your engine up and running. The next up we have is academies. Academies are great. If you place an academy out somewhere, you gain access to a specialist card like this one here. Specialist cards have a unique special ability that you can activate during the indicated phase of play. Some you can play anytime, regardless of which player's turn it is. But regardless, the ability is always powerful. Once you utilize a specialist card, you'll flip it face down, and it'll be used for the game. Well, mostly. But if you choose to keep a specialist faced up until the end of the game, you can also get victory points for them. This flexibility offers some amazing strategic options for you as you advance through the game of Seastead. The last option that you have available to you is a port. Ports allow you to place docks. Docks are key to making lots of points at the end game. Say I placed a port here. You'll choose one of the available ports. There's usually 3 out at any given time, but let's say I picked this one. You'll slot it into the location at which you just built your port, and this dock will give you some additional bonuses at the end of the game. First off, it's going to lay out a particular resource, and it will give you victory points for how many of those resources you have at the end of the game. Up to 3, at least. So it'll start to give you an idea of what sort of resources you might want to collect when the game is getting close to finishing. Also, it lays out bonuses around that particular flotilla, making specific structures at specific places worth more. For instance, here we see that a shipyard over to the right here is worth an additional victory point. That would make this location worth 4 to me or my opponent if they'd built there. Also, we could see that an academy in this space here would be an additional 2 points. This academy didn't quite make the cut, and he won't get any extra points, but it's still good to have him around. Be careful with these, though, because your opponent can also take advantage of the bonuses that your docks present, so make sure you're not handing them free victory points. Completing buildings can offer you various rewards depending on what you complete. For every column of each building that you complete, you're able to switch the costs of 2 flotillas that are present on the board. When you complete an entire row of one type of structure, you also get a once per game bonus that depends on the structure that you complete. For instance, if you completed all of your shipyards, you would be able to reassign your ships around the flotillas as you see fit. This can grant you additional plans and strategies for discounts and resource gathering from your opponent. When you complete your academies, you are able to flip face up all of the specialist cards that you had flipped face down by using them. This will allow you to use them again in this game or keep them face up for their victory point value. Finally, when you complete your ports, you are able to build your final dock. And then you're able to choose one of the docks that you have completed, and you will gain a cleanup token for each of the corresponding resource type that you have in your inventory. For instance, if I selected this dock and I did have this iron in my inventory, I would gain a cleanup token. Cleanup tokens are worth victory points at the end of the game. Now, speaking of endgame, let's talk about how Seastead ends. There are 4 various conditions that can trigger the endgame. The first is if a flotilla is completely developed. So if there is a building on each of the 6 spaces on a flotilla, that's one indicator that the game is over. The second is if a player has only 1 building left on their player board. That is an indicator that the game end is approaching. Next, if a depth card is revealed on the dive deck, most of them will be these simple, dark face value pieces. But if all of these have been completed, then we get to these kind of white, cracked cards. And if one of these is face up, that is an indicator that we're on the final turn of the game. And finally, if all of the cleanup tokens have been taken by either of the players, so if they've been divvied out, that is the final indicator that the game is going to end. You'll play through one more round of the game at this point, and then you'll tally up your victory points. You'll do that by looking at the various docks that you have assigned on the board, utilizing them to calculate their score, any resource bonuses that you may gain from those docks. You'll also tally up your cleanup tokens, the victory points of the actual locations that your buildings are at, and any specialist cards. After that, whoever has the most victory points is the winner. And that is Seastead in a nutshell. I hope you enjoyed getting to learn a little bit about the complexity of the game and some of the actions that you can take and just overall what you need to do to succeed. But what did I think of it? Well, Seastead quickly took a special place in my heart. I love how accessible it is, how easy it is to teach. You do one of two things on your turn. You're going to dive or you're going to build. But there's a lot of nuanced decision making that pops up in the game as you play through it. When you dive, you're always going to be giving something to your opponent, so you've got to figure out how to give them the least helpful thing possible. And that becomes quite a challenge sometimes. Really, you want to find yourself pressing your opponent to dive so that they have to give you some scraps, and then you're trying to make the most out of what they give you, which becomes a problem and a difficulty all in of itself. Building is really where the strategy and depth of Seastead begins to shine. You have to think about where you want to build because there's this cascade of bonuses. You get a bonus from the place that you build, but then the type of building also gives you a bonus, which you have to capitalize on, and potentially there's going to be a column or a row bonus on the time that you build as well, not to count even specialist cards that you could chain together in that. And so there becomes some really neat combos that you can dream up and bring to fruition through a game of Seastead, and I love that. I love that the game itself is very clean and accessible, but that there's a lot of depth to how you chain together your buildings and your turns. This doesn't, of course, even begin to dive into how complex the docks can be. The fact that docks can chain together and begin to make one spot incredibly valuable for in-game victory points. It also dictates the kind of resources you'll want to hoard for the end game and how you'll want to start stockpiling those. And there's just a lot of great choices that are available at Seastead, and it's pretty accessible for any level of gamer. Now, beyond that, we didn't even mention this yet, but there's actually a B side to all of the flotilla tiles. There are B-level specialist cards that can be played with separately or added to this whole deck, and there's also a separate deck of decree cards that come out that add additional stipulations or rules as the rounds go on throughout the game, and those also add another layer of depth and complexity to Seastead. So while this game may be pretty nice and entry-level as you get into it, there's a lot of depth that you can add as you kind of add these modular strategic elements to the game. And so I think that Seastead brings a lot to bear for how small the box is, and honestly, the playtime. You can get through a game of Seastead in 30 to 50 minutes, I would say, with any two players, and it's great. It's really accessible and quick and clean. The turns go fast and are engaging because even on your opponent's turn, their action, you're getting something, usually, or something's happening that impacts the lay of the board. There's just a lot of great depth and strategy that comes out in Seastead that I think you'll enjoy. Now, I'll be honest, there was a time when I didn't enjoy two-player games. I thought board gaming was meant to be these large group game settings. That was how you played a board game, but really, I think two-player games have earned a special place in my heart because the game design just shines through so much in a two-player game. In larger count games, there's a little bit of a fudge element. There's a little bit of a soft factor. You can count on the table to round out some of the hard edges in the corners of a game. If someone is ahead, then you can count on the table to maybe help bring them back in, rein them in. Or if there's a big exploit or loophole, usually the table can kind of balance that out. But in a two-player game, every element of the game has to be so tight and nuanced together. Every interaction has to be just right. It can't be too harsh or too soft, because that would ruin the engagement of the game. You can't have one player running ahead with a lead because there's only two players. The game has to encourage interactions that are nuanced and are tight so that the game feels engaging all the way through to completion for both players. And I think that Seastead does a really good job of capturing that in its gameplay, in its interactions. Every interaction has a positive factor for your opponent, almost always. And there's always going to be this kind of give and take that you have to balance as you play through Seastead. And I think that's a huge A+ for this game. If I were to give it a rating, I would say this is an 8 out of 10 in the two-player game category. It's one that I will certainly keep in my collection and look forward to getting to the table. And I think you will too. So if you're looking for a two-player game, you're in the market for something new, then I would encourage you to check out Seastead by WizKids Games. Thanks for watching this video. I really hope you enjoyed it. Check out some of our other Meeple Mountain content. I promise you won't be disappointed. This is Tyler Williams, signing off.